February 16, 1944, Moen Island, within the sprawling perimeter of Truk Lagoon. The sky above the Caroline Islands is a brilliant, uninterrupted, blinding blue. The horizon line, where the Pacific Ocean meets the heavens, is completely empty. There are no enemy fleets staining the turquoise water, no American heavy bombers blotting out the tropical sun, and no air raid sirens tearing through the heavy, suffocating air. Inside the claustrophobic, heat-baked cockpit of a Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter parked on the sun-scorched tarmac, a pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy sits tightly strapped into his leather seat. He is entirely alone. He is not under attack. Yet his hands are shaking so violently that he cannot maintain a basic grip on the control stick. His breathing is terribly shallow and erratic, pulling in hot metallic-tasting air in desperate, rapid, dry gasps. Cold sweat stings his bloodshot eyes and soaks through his heavy cotton flight suit, plastering the fabric against his trembling, severely dehydrated skin. His vision is actively tunneling, blurring the complex instrument panel in front of him into a smeared, incomprehensible canvas of black and grey dials. He is experiencing sudden, terrifying micro-sleeps, his brain forcing localized shutdowns just to prevent catastrophic damage. He is actively losing consciousness right there on the runway. He has not been shot by an American fighter. He has not sustained a single millimeter of physical trauma or kinetic damage, but he is dying a systemic, invisible death. His central nervous system is currently experiencing a catastrophic, cascading failure of monumental proportions. The adrenal glands, which have been forcibly pumping cortisol and epinephrine into his heavily taxed bloodstream non-stop for the past 14 agonizing days, are completely and utterly empty. His biological battery has run completely dry. He is experiencing a total physiological and psychological collapse. This collapse is brought on not by the sudden, violent kinetic energy of a dogfight over the ocean, but by the agonizing, suffocating, relentless weight of absolute exhaustion. He slowly slumps forward against his harness, his heavy forehead coming to rest against the cold glass of the instrument cluster. He is a casualty of a massive, sweeping battle that has not even officially begun. Truk Lagoon was widely known as the Gibraltar of the Pacific. It was the ultimate, impenetrable anchorage, the most feared and heavily fortified forward operating base in the entire Japanese Empire's vast defensive perimeter. It boasted 5 highly active, heavily defended airfields spread across multiple volcanic islands, including Moen, Eton, and Param. It housed hundreds of advanced combat aircraft, from agile fighters to heavy torpedo bombers, ready to launch at a moment's notice. It was ringed by a devastating, overlapping array of heavy coastal defense guns and rapid-fire anti-aircraft batteries carved directly into the living rock of the islands. It was designed, engineered, and believed to be completely impregnable to any conventional assault. How does a fortress of this unprecedented magnitude, manned by thousands of soldiers fiercely indoctrinated with the unwavering, unyielding samurai ethos, simply fall apart from the inside out? How does an entire, highly integrated defensive network collapse into dysfunction before a single enemy shot is fired in anger? The answer lies in a fundamental, fatal misunderstanding of human endurance and military logistics. The fortress was not initially breached by an overwhelming, deafening barrage of high explosives from American battleships. It was breached by a terrifying, prolonged, and absolute psychological silence. The American forces, whether by conscious planning or operational necessity, created conditions that exploited something the Japanese High Command refused to acknowledge. Human willpower has a strict, measurable biological limit. The human body is an engine, and like any engine operating at maximum revolutions per minute, it consumes vital fuel. When a frontline soldier is placed on maximum combat alert, the brain instantly demands massive, unsustainable amounts of glucose. The heart rate elevates dangerously, the pupils dilate to gather light, and the muscles tense rigidly, ready for instantaneous, violent action. This hypervigilant state is a primitive evolutionary survival mechanism specifically designed to last for a few minutes, perhaps a few hours at most. It is categorically not designed to last for 14 consecutive days and nights under a tropical sun. forcing their elite pilots and anti-aircraft crews to remain in a state of heightened, sustained readiness, whether continuously or through repeated false alarms. The Japanese command was draining the most critical logistical resource they possessed. They were actively burning through the cognitive processing power of their own men. Every false alarm, every unidentifiable shadow on the horizon, every misidentified cloud formation triggered another massive, wasteful dump of adrenaline into their systems. Eventually, the biological receptors simply burn out, leaving the highly trained soldier completely numb, deeply apathetic, and functionally paralyzed. Conventional history books and post-war documentaries often paint a very specific, highly explosive picture of Operation Hailstone. They confidently claim that on the early morning of February 17, Admiral Raymond Spruance and the massive American Task Force 58 rolled into the Central Pacific and systematically destroyed Truk Lagoon with sheer, overwhelming industrial might. They enthusiastically describe the endless waves of Hellcat fighters, Avenger torpedo bombers, and dauntless dive bombers raining fire and steel down upon the anchored merchant ships and pristine airstrips. That narrative is a highly convenient, sanitized myth designed for easy public consumption. It is a gross simplification that entirely ignores the grim, complex reality of how the base was truly, fundamentally dismantled. Task Force 58 did not actually destroy the core defenses of Truk Lagoon on the morning of February 17. The formidable defense grid of Truk Lagoon had already been systematically dismantled, hollowed out and psychologically gutted over the 14 agonizing days prior to the very first American bomb dropping. The Gibraltar of the Pacific fell to a weapon that left no smoking craters, shattered no reinforced concrete, and produced no jagged shrapnel. Whether by deliberate design or tactical fortune, the Americans had weaponized the excruciating agony of waiting itself. The delay, whether strategic or circumstantial, created a form of psychological attrition against an enemy that believed themselves entirely immune to fear. This is not a standard, glorified battle recap filled with romanticized aerial dogfights and heroic, glorious last stands. This is a strict forensic audit of the human nervous system placed under total, inescapable siege. We are going to deeply examine the cruel, unforgiving mathematics of severe sleep deprivation and relentless sensory overload. We will carefully dissect the tactical weaponization of false alarms and terrifying phantom threats hiding in the dark. We will analyze exactly how the United States military deliberately and coldly exploited the rigid biological limits of the Japanese Imperial Navy's frontline personnel. We will look closely at the balance sheets of human physiology, calculating the exact tragic moment when the human mind simply refuses to process the reality of an incoming threat. This is the largely untold story of how an invincible, sprawling fortress of coral and steel was broken entirely by the sheer, devastating exhaustion of the men forced to defend it. This is the psychological trap of Hailstone. Long before the impressive hardware of the Japanese war machine was shattered by American torpedoes, the biological software running it was completely corrupted by manufactured anxiety. The human brain absolutely requires substantial downtime to function, process new information, and survive. When a rigid military system systematically denies that fundamental biological necessity in the name of discipline, it inevitably defeats itself long before the enemy ever arrives to claim the victory. The catastrophic destruction of Truk Lagoon began with a terrifying ghost, and it ended with an absolute, undeniable slaughter. To truly understand the sheer magnitude of this psychological collapse, one must first understand the terrifying physical reality of Truk Lagoon in early 1944. Geographically, it was a masterpiece of natural defense. A massive continuous barrier reef stretching over 225 kilometers completely enclosed a deep, sheltered body of water. Inside this protective coral ring, 11 major volcanic islands rose sharply from the Pacific, their steep peaks covered in dense, impenetrable jungle. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent years transforming this natural sanctuary into the most heavily fortified naval base outside of the Japanese home islands. They had painstakingly constructed 5 fully operational airfields, a massive seaplane base, and deep water anchorages capable of holding the entire combined fleet. Its absolute peak, the lagoon had safely harbored super battleships like the Yamato and the Musashi, though both had departed by late January 1944, alongside fleets of aircraft carriers, heavy cruisers, and essential logistics vessels. To protect this invaluable asset, Japanese engineers had ringed the islands with an interlocking neck of heavy coastal defense guns. The few navigable passages through the deadly barrier reef were heavily mined and constantly monitored by vigilant coastal watchers. Hundreds of advanced combat aircraft, including the dreaded Mitsubishi A6M Zeros and Nakajima B5N torpedo bombers, sat ready on the hardstands of Eton, Param, Moen, and Dublon. On paper, and in the minds of the Allied planners who intensely studied the aerial photographs, Truk was an absolute nightmare. It was a fortress designed specifically to absorb and repel a massive, conventional amphibious invasion and heavy naval bombardment. However, the formidable physical hardware of Truk Lagoon was entirely dependent on a deeply flawed, hyper-rigid operational doctrine. This was the first fatal nail in the coffin of the Gibraltar of the Pacific. We can accurately classify this as the doctrine trap. The entire Japanese defensive strategy for Truk rested upon a single foundational pillar: early warning and absolute, instantaneous interception. The military logic dictated that as long as the defenders could see the enemy coming, the sheer volume of their anti-aircraft fire and the skill of their fighter pilots would easily annihilate any attacking force before it reached the inner lagoon. Therefore, the primary directive for the entire garrison was to maintain a posture of constant, unbroken hypervigilance. Every single soldier, sailor, and aviator stationed at the base was explicitly trained to react to the slightest provocation with maximum lethal force. This tactical doctrine was heavily reinforced by the pervasive, unyielding cultural philosophy of the imperial Japanese military. The rigid samurai ethos, combined with the modern concept of invincible spiritual strength known as seishin, demanded unwavering, absolute dedication from every man. Japanese military planners fundamentally and genuinely believed that sheer willpower could easily overcome any physical or material limitations of the human body. In their strict, unforgiving command structure, admitting fatigue was not seen as a biological reality, but as a severe moral failing and a cowardly lack of loyalty to the emperor. The High Command assumed with deadly arrogance that human beings could sustain a state of maximum combat readiness infinitely, provided they possessed enough discipline and fighting spirit. They ordered their men to be ready to fight and die at a moment's notice, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without question or complaint. This is exactly where the Japanese architects of Truk Lagoon exposed their catastrophic terminal blind spot. They had constructed a magnificent, terrifying fortress out of sharp coral, hardened steel, and thousands of tons of high explosives. But they had completely forgotten that this entire complex system was ultimately operated by a highly fragile piece of biological software, the human brain. The human body is absolutely not a machine, and it cannot be commanded to function like one, regardless of how intense the ideological indoctrination might be. When a human being is placed on high combat alert, the autonomic nervous system instantly shifts into a primitive, desperate survival mode. The sympathetic nervous system forcefully kicks in, flooding the bloodstream with massive, potent doses of adrenaline and cortisol. This powerful chemical reaction is specifically designed by millions of years of evolution to provide a brief, explosive burst of energy to either fight for survival or flee from immediate, deadly danger. It instantly sharpens visual acuity, dramatically increases oxygen flow to the major muscle groups, and temporarily suppresses the sensation of pain. However, this extreme physiological state is incredibly expensive and highly toxic to maintain for prolonged periods. It burns through vast amounts of caloric energy and places a massive, unsustainable strain on the heart, the lungs, and the delicate neural pathways of the central nervous system. Evolution designed the fight-off or flight response to last for perhaps 20 minutes while escaping a predator in the wild. It was absolutely, categorically not designed to be sustained for days or weeks on end while staring nervously at an empty, sun-baked oceanic horizon. By strictly enforcing a doctrine of perpetual unblinking readiness, the Japanese commanders were inadvertently executing a highly effective campaign of severe physiological sabotage against their own elite forces. They were demanding that their highly trained pilots and anti-aircraft gunners keep their biological engines redlined at maximum revolutions per minute while firmly holding down the brakes. Without proper restorative downtime, the adrenal glands simply run out of the chemicals necessary to sustain the alert state. The brain, heavily deprived of crucial REM sleep and overwhelmed by constant unresolved tension, begins to aggressively shut down non-essential functions just to preserve baseline biological survival. Reflexes degrade dramatically, fine motor skills completely evaporate, and the ability to process complex tactical information or make rational command decisions completely collapses. The Japanese had built the perfect physical fortress, but they had unknowingly rigged it with a silent biological time bomb. Their defense grid was highly sophisticated on paper, but it was incredibly brittle in human reality. It required every single human component to function flawlessly, without rest, in a constant state of maximum, exhausting terror. The American tacticians preparing for Operation Hailstone did not need to invent a new secret superweapon to crack the Gibraltar of the Pacific. They simply needed to strategically introduce a massive prolonged stressor into this highly rigid, unforgiving defensive system. If they could force the Japanese to activate their biological fight or flight response and then deny them the actual fight, the resulting psychological friction would tear the fortress apart from the inside out. The lethal trap was set not by the attackers, but by the inflexible, uncompromising doctrine of the defenders themselves. The American reconnaissance flights provided the terrifying ghost that kept the Japanese wide awake. The activation of this biological time bomb began 13 days before the actual battle. On February 4, 1944, two United States WWII PB-4Y1 Liberator patrol bombers appeared high over the pristine waters of the lagoon. They were flying a deeply intrusive photo reconnaissance mission, their heavy cameras clicking methodically as they mapped the sprawling fortress below. They were not there to drop high explosives or initiate a dogfight. Their primary mission was information gathering, but their immediate tactical effect was far more devastating. They were intentionally spotted by the Japanese coastal watchers and anti-aircraft crews. The moment those twin-engine silhouettes were positively identified, the meticulously designed defensive system of Truk Lagoon sprang violently to life. The base responded exactly as its rigid doctrine dictated. Massive air raid sirens wailed across the volcanic islands, their terrifying mechanical screams echoing off the deep valleys and carrying far across the water. The pilots of the 22nd and 26th Air Flotillas dropped whatever they were doing and sprinted frantically toward their waiting fighters. Mechanics violently cranked the heavy radial engines of the Zeros into life, filling the humid air with the choking stench of aviation fuel and thick exhaust. Thousands of anti-aircraft gunners slammed heavy brass-cased shells into their breeches, aggressively scanning the empty blue sky for the inevitable incoming American strike package, the entire fortress rigidly braced for the apocalypse. Every single soldier on the island experienced a massive, instantaneous dump of adrenaline directly into their bloodstream. Their heart rates skyrocketed, their pupils dilated wide to catch the sunlight, and their muscles twitched with the desperate anticipation of extreme violence. They were absolutely ready to fight, bleed, and die for the Emperor in that exact moment. But the American strike package never came. An hour passed in suffocating, sweat-drenched silence. Then 3 hours. Then an entire day slowly burned away under the relentless, punishing tropical sun. The sky remained mockingly, perfectly empty. However, because the Japanese command structure was utterly inflexible, the maximum alert status was strictly maintained. commanders logically assumed the reconnaissance planes were the immediate precursors to a massive carrier strike. They believed the Americans were simply waiting just over the horizon, biding their time to strike at dusk or dawn. Therefore, the order was given to hold the line at all costs. Pilots were explicitly forbidden from returning to their barracks or removing their heavy flight suits. They were ordered to sleep fitfully on the hard, unyielding concrete of the tarmac, curling up directly underneath the wings of their fully fueled, fully armed aircraft. Gunners were ordered to remain locked into their firing seats, their aching eyes continuously straining against the blinding glare of the sun reflecting off the ocean. This is where the true excruciating agony of psychological warfare takes root. The human brain is highly adept at processing immediate kinetic threats, like a bullet flying past or a bomb detonating nearby. It is absolutely terrible at processing a phantom threat that refuses to materialize. The agonizing tension of continuously staring at an empty horizon inevitably begins to manufacture its own ghosts. The absolute silence of the lagoon became louder and more terrifying than the roar of incoming engines. Exhausted, severely dehydrated sentries began to hear the phantom droning of American bombers in the crashing of the waves. They began to interpret the normal shifting shadows of the jungle canopy as infiltrating infantry. This psychological mechanism is known as waiting for the other shoe to drop, and it is a form of exquisite, highly refined mental torture. The nervous system is desperately screaming for the physical release of combat, for the chaotic release of pent-up kinetic energy. When that release is systematically denied, the energy turns inward, rapidly consuming the host's sanity and physical stamina. For the men on the ground, accounts suggest the days blurred into a nightmare of repeated alerts and sustained tension. The temperature on the tarmac regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the cockpits into literal ovens. The mechanics, forced to constantly run the engines to ensure rapid take-off capabilities, inhaled toxic fumes hour after hour. The sheer caloric deficit began to take a severe toll on the men. You cannot sustain a high alert heart rate without burning massive amounts of biological fuel, and the standard military rations were quickly depleted by bodies running in a constant state of panic. Minor fluctuations in early warning radar, which were often just flocks of birds or atmospheric anomalies, were immediately interpreted as incoming bomber formations. The sirens would scream again, forcing the exhausted men to scramble back to their stations, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They would grip their weapons, stare into the blinding blue void, and wait for the death that stubbornly refused to arrive. This cycle repeated endlessly. Every false alarm was a microscopic tear in the fabric of their discipline. Every hour spent waiting was a deliberate withdrawal from their bank of operational readiness. The American High Command, hundreds of miles away in their air-conditioned plotting rooms, did not need to fire a single shot during this phase. The Japanese defenders were defeating themselves through the sheer terror of anticipation. The phantom of the American Navy was doing the heavy lifting before the real ships even weighed anchor. The Gibraltar of the Pacific was bleeding out, not from shrapnel wounds, but from the systemic failure of its own terrified nervous system. Here we must examine the specific mechanics of biological attrition. What precisely happens to a highly trained human being when they are systematically deprived of proper restorative rest for 72 consecutive hours? We can classify this physiological breakdown as the second nail in the coffin, the adrenaline crash. Military psychologists and modern combat physicians understand this progression intimately. During the first 24 hours of high alert status, the body relies on stored glucose and a massive, continuous surge of cortisol. The soldier is highly alert, jittery, and incredibly responsive. By hour 48, the body has exhausted its readily available glucose reserves. To maintain basic survival functions, the brain begins to aggressively cannibalize muscle tissue for raw energy. Fine motor skills, the precise, minute muscle movements required to smoothly operate the throttle of a fighter plane or rapidly calculate the trajectory of an anti-aircraft shell, begin to degrade significantly. By hour 72, the central nervous system enters a state of severe undeniable crisis. Reaction times drop by a staggering 40%. More critically, the prefrontal cortex, the highly evolved area of the brain responsible for logical reasoning, threat assessment, and rational decision-making, begins to systematically shut down. A combat pilot who has been awake for 3 days possesses the cognitive processing power and delayed reflexes of someone who is severely intoxicated. Their vision blurs, their depth perception becomes entirely unreliable, and their ability to regulate extreme emotional responses completely evaporates. Now, multiply that profound physical degradation by 14 agonizing days. By mid-February, the formidable Japanese garrison at Truk Lagoon was effectively operating in a state of mass, synchronized delirium. They were physically present, but cognitively they were entirely absent. This absolute exhaustion was compounded by the third nail in the coffin, the psychological phenomenon of the false positive. The fable of the boy who cried wolf is not merely a children's story. It is a fundamental, deeply ingrained flaw in human psychology. When the massive air raid sirens howled across Truk Lagoon for the 10th time in a single week, and absolutely nothing materialized from the clouds, the psychological impact of that sound fundamentally shifted. The initial terrifying wail of the siren originally triggered a massive, life-saving surge of survival instinct. It meant the enemy was here, and it was time to fight. But after 2 continuous weeks of paralyzing false alarms, that exact same acoustic frequency became something else entirely. It became a trigger for profound, overwhelming irritation, deep apathy, and extreme emotional fatigue. The Japanese defenders, entirely drained of their adrenaline reserves, stopped viewing the siren as a genuine warning of imminent death. Instead, they began to subconsciously view it as an annoying administrative interruption to their desperately needed rest. Their exhausted brains simply refused to process the warning as a legitimate threat anymore. The biological software had successfully trained itself to completely ignore the critical hardware warnings. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, the aggressive commander of Task Force 58, and Admiral Raymond Spruance, the calculating architect of the operation, took their time approaching Truk. Whether they fully understood the psychological toll their reconnaissance flights were inflicting, or whether operational necessity simply created the delay, their massive armada steadily closed the distance without rushing into the heavily defended base. The effect was the same. Psychological poison circulated through the Japanese command structure. They were perfectly content to wait, while the Japanese aggressively burned through their own precious aviation fuel-running engines on the tarmac. They were perfectly content to wait while the Japanese consumed their dwindling daily calorie rations in a state of high, unproductive anxiety. And most importantly, they were perfectly content to wait while the Japanese systematically eroded their own irreplaceable sanity. The sheer, terrifying weight of anticipation functioned as a highly destructive weapon of mass attrition. By February 15th, the once invincible Gibraltar of the Pacific was functionally disabled. It had not been struck by a single bomb, yet it was already crumbling from within. Mechanics, their hands shaking violently from chronic sleep deprivation, began making critical, fatal errors in basic engine maintenance. Anti-aircraft gunners, their eyes burning and heavily bloodshot from staring relentlessly into the glaring tropical sun, were experiencing terrifying, vivid waking hallucinations. Pilots, the highly revered elite samurai of the sky, were physically incapable of climbing into their cockpits without direct physical assistance from their ground crews. The entire complex, interlocking defensive grid was staggering blindly on the absolute edge of total collapse. The Japanese high command on the island, witnessing the utter physical and mental devastation of their own men, was finally forced to confront a brutal, unavoidable biological reality. Their rigid, unyielding doctrine of infinite spiritual endurance had fundamentally failed them. They simply could not keep their men at maximum alert status for another day without risking a total mutiny of the human nervous system. They had to make a choice: continue the alert and watch their men die of exhaustion on the runway, or stand down and pray the Americans were bluffing. And so, on February 16, 1944, they made the most fatal, devastating logistical calculation of the entire Pacific War. By the middle of February, the Imperial Japanese Navy garrison stationed at Truk Lagoon had reached the absolute limits of human biological endurance. The complex, interlocking machinery of the supposedly impregnable fortress was still physically intact, but the fragile human software required to operate it had fundamentally crashed. The severe sleep deprivation had cascaded into widespread cognitive failure across all ranks. Highly experienced aviation mechanics, men who could normally strip and rebuild a complex radial engine blindfolded, were now making catastrophic rudimentary mistakes on the flight line. They were forgetting to properly secure fuel lines, dropping crucial tools into sensitive intake valves, and misreading essential pressure gauges. The frontline anti-aircraft gunners, whose singular job was to scan the sky and pull the trigger, were practically catatonic. Many were found actively hallucinating, their deeply exhausted brains spontaneously generating terrifying images of American bombers that simply did not exist. The elite fighter pilots of the 22nd and 26th Air Flotillas, the very tip of the Japanese spear, were experiencing severe tremors, vertigo, and an absolute inability to focus their eyes. They were no longer a cohesive, lethal fighting force. They were a sprawling collection of physically broken, deeply traumatized men, desperately clinging to the very edge of consciousness. It was in this atmosphere of profound, undeniable physical collapse that the Japanese High Command made a fateful, catastrophic logistical decision. On the evening of February 16th, fully acknowledging that their men were effectively dying on their feet without a single shot being fired, the base commander issued a general stand-down order. The punishing state of maximum alert, which had been rigidly maintained for nearly 2 agonizing weeks, was abruptly cancelled. Shore leave was immediately granted to the exhausted air crews and frontline personnel. A massive, collective sigh of overwhelming relief swept across the volcanic islands of Moen, Eton, and Param. The terrifying Relentless pressure valve had finally been released. However, this sudden release created a new, even more deadly psychological phenomenon, the illusion of absolute security. The Japanese defenders, desperate for any logical justification to rest, immediately embraced a deeply flawed, highly convenient assumption. They convinced themselves that the American reconnaissance flights had merely been a bluff. They rationalized that the United States Navy was simply too intimidated by the fearsome reputation of Truk Lagoon to actually launch a direct, full-scale assault. The agonizing tension of the past 14 days instantly evaporated, instantly replaced by a crushing, irresistible wave of lethargy. The men did not just go to sleep. Their biologically depleted bodies plunged into a deep, comatose slumber, a desperate physiological attempt to rapidly repair the massive neurological damage inflicted by 2 weeks of hypervigilance. The radar operators relaxed their intense scrutiny of the glowing green screens. The anti-aircraft gunners finally stepped away from their heavy weapons and collapsed into their bunks. The pilots eagerly abandoned their uncomfortable, sun-baked cockpits and headed into the local towns for heavily rationed alcohol and desperately needed rest. The Gibraltar of the Pacific, the most feared fortress in the entire theater of war, was finally quiet. The air raid sirens were completely silent. The runway floodlights were powered down to conserve precious diesel fuel. The sprawling lagoon was bathed in the soft, peaceful light of a tropical night. It was a scenario that worked perfectly in the Americans' favor. The Japanese had not just grown tired, they had convinced themselves that the attack was not coming today. Whether Spruance had calculated this outcome or simply benefited from it, the result was devastating. He had allowed the biological limits of the Japanese soldiers to effectively disarm the greatest fortress in the Pacific Ocean. The physiological shift from extreme, prolonged panic to sudden, absolute relaxation is incredibly violent on the human body. When the stand-down order was formally broadcast across the base's communication network, the immediate physical reaction was not celebration, but collapse. Medical officers stationed at the base recorded a sudden, massive spike in men fainting directly where they stood. Without the artificial, toxic support of continuous adrenaline pumping through their veins, their cardiovascular system simply plummeted to baseline levels too rapidly. Blood pressure dropped sharply, causing widespread dizziness and nausea. The deep, gnawing hunger that had been entirely suppressed by combat anxiety returned with a ferocious, agonizing intensity. The logistics of feeding thousands of suddenly ravenous, exhausted men placed an immediate severe strain on the base's already compromised supply chains. Furthermore, the quality of sleep they were about to experience was fundamentally flawed. They were not transitioning into normal, restorative sleep cycles. They were essentially experiencing a system-wide biological crash, entering a state of profound unresponsiveness that closely mirrored clinical unconsciousness. In this specific, deeply compromised state, the human brain is exceptionally slow to react to new external stimuli. It requires significantly more time and much louder auditory triggers to drag the consciousness back to a waking state. By authorizing shore leave and a general stand-down on the night of February 16th, the Japanese command had unknowingly signed a collective death warrant. They had effectively deafened and blinded their own heavily fortified early warning systems. The coastal watchers, whose eyes were meant to be the first line of defense against an incoming fleet, struggled to keep their heavy eyelids open. The complex, electrically operated minefields protecting the reef passages were left unmonitored as the technicians finally succumbed to exhaustion. Even the formidable heavy cruisers and destroyers, anchored safely inside the deep lagoon, reduced their boiler pressures and granted their crews permission to stand down from general quarters. The American tactical delay had achieved a strategic outcome that no amount of naval artillery could have ever accomplished. It had convinced the Japanese Imperial Navy to willingly disarm its own invincible fortress. The agonizing, invisible war of nerves was officially over. The Japanese had definitively lost. The stage was now perfectly set for an absolute massacre in the dark. Approximately 4:30 a.m., February 17, 1944, 90 minutes before dawn, the American carriers of Task Force 58 finally launched their deadly strike packages. Waves of Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters roared off the wooden flight decks into the pitch-black Pacific sky. They did not climb to a high, fuel-efficient cruising altitude. Instead, they dropped down to just barely above the rolling waves, flying dangerously low to deliberately stay completely underneath the coverage of the Japanese early warning radar. They approached the supposedly impenetrable Gibraltar of the Pacific like silent, lethal assassins in the dark. The deafening roar of hundreds of massive radial engines built up over the barrier reef like the approach of a catastrophic, unnatural thunderstorm. Inside the barracks on Moen, Eton, and Param, the deeply exhausted Japanese defenders were suddenly ripped from their comatose slumber. This time, it was not the mechanical, irritating wail of the air raid siren that woke them. It was the unmistakable, terrifying thunder of real enemy aircraft screaming directly overhead at full throttle. For the severely sleep-deprived human brain, the sudden transition from deep restorative sleep to immediate, violent combat is physiologically devastating. The sensory overload was absolute and instantly paralyzing. The Japanese soldiers staggered out of their bunks, their vision blurred, their limbs heavy and unresponsive, their minds completely unable to process the horrific reality unfolding around them. They had spent the last 2 weeks intensely hallucinating this exact moment, and now that it was actually happening, their broken cognitive software registered it as just another terrible dream. They were physically present, but neurologically they were completely disconnected from the immediate threat. Historical reports and subsequent combat analyses paint a grim, undeniable picture of the sheer pathetic helplessness of the garrison that morning. The elite Japanese fighter pilots, the men who were supposed to aggressively intercept the American armada, scrambled frantically toward their aircraft parked on the hardstands. But their severely depleted bodies simply betrayed them at the critical moment. Eyewitness accounts detail pilots weeping in absolute frustration because their trembling, exhausted arms lacked the basic physical strength to pull themselves up into the cockpits of their Zeros. Ground crews, equally incapacitated by the prolonged psychological attrition, fumbled blindly with ammunition belts and fuel hoses in the confusing pre-dawn darkness. The highly synchronized, lethal defensive machine had completely seized up. At the precise moment the American Hellcats arrived over the airfields, practically the entire Japanese air defense network was totally offline. Out of the hundreds of formidable combat aircraft stationed at Truk Lagoon, only a tiny, insignificant fraction ever managed to get their wheels off the concrete. The vast majority of the Japanese planes were caught entirely defenseless, still securely tied down to the tarmac, sitting like sitting ducks in perfectly aligned rows. The American pilots did not encounter a fierce, legendary samurai defense. They encountered a paralyzed, heavily sedated giant. The Hellcats systematically and mercilessly strafed the flight lines, their 50 caliber machine guns tearing the fragile unarmored Zeros and Mitsubishi bombers into burning shreds of aluminum. Massive aviation fuel dumps, left fully exposed by the exhausted logistics crews, detonated into towering, catastrophic fireballs that illuminated the entire lagoon in a hellish orange glow. The carnage was not a battle. It was an absolute, undisputed slaughter. The heavy anti-aircraft batteries, which had been fully manned and intensely vigilant for 2 solid weeks, were largely silent during the most critical opening minutes of the actual raid. The gunners, desperately fighting off the suffocating lethargy of their sudden awakening, could not track the fast-moving American fighters in the dark. Without the crucial fire control radar that had been resting on the bottom of the ocean for months, and without the sharp rested reflexes necessary to visually track a moving target, their return fire was wildly inaccurate and entirely ineffective. They were simply firing blindly into the chaos, their heavy shells exploding harmlessly high in the empty stratosphere, while the American planes methodically destroyed everything on the ground. By the time the sun finally rose over the horizon on February 17, illuminating the once pristine lagoon, the outcome of Operation Hailstone had already been permanently decided. The airfields on Etten, Moen and Dublon were reduced to cratered, burning wastelands of twisted metal and shattered concrete. The sky, which the Japanese command had so arrogantly assumed they completely controlled, belonged entirely to the United States Navy. And the sprawling fleet of merchant vessels, crucial tankers, and light warships anchored helplessly in the deep water below were entirely stripped of their air cover. They were now perfectly exposed, waiting in agonizing terror for the devastating arrival of the heavy American dive bombers and torpedo planes. The American Avenger torpedo bombers arrived shortly after the fighters, finding the skies completely clear of enemy interceptors. They did not have to weave through a deadly curtain of disciplined anti-aircraft fire. They were able to conduct their bombing runs with the calm, methodical precision of a peacetime training exercise. The chain of command on the island completely broke down, unable to issue coherent orders amidst the deafening noise and absolute panic. Communication lines remained dead because the radio operators had simply fallen asleep at their posts and could not be quickly revived. The psychological trap had worked with a terrifying, flawless efficiency. The American High Command had correctly calculated that the most effective way to disarm a highly disciplined, fanatical enemy was to aggressively turn their own rigid discipline against them. By forcing the Japanese to strictly maintain a maximum combat posture against an empty sky, they had successfully burned out the nervous systems of thousands of elite defenders. The Gibraltar of the Pacific had been fundamentally broken not by the explosive yield of American bombs, but by the devastating invisible weight of its own crippling exhaustion. The Japanese had spent 14 excruciating days fiercely fighting a terrifying ghost of their own creation. When the real executioner finally arrived to deliver the fatal blow, they simply had no strength left to lift their swords. The accounting of Operation Hailstone usually begins with raw, staggering numbers, but it rarely stays there for long. If we strictly examine the traditional balance sheet of military destruction, the statistics are undeniably catastrophic. In less than 48 hours of actual combat, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost approximately 250 aircraft. Estimates vary between 250 and 275 in different sources. 32 critical merchant ships, massive tankers, and vital cargo vessels were systematically sent to the bottom of the lagoon. Heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and multiple destroyers were ruthlessly hunted down and destroyed as they desperately attempted to flee through the narrow reef passages. Nearly 200,000 tons of irreplaceable Japanese shipping capacity was completely obliterated in a single devastating stroke. This represented almost 1/10 of all Japanese shipping losses over the entire 8-month period spanning from November 1943 to June 1944. Approximately 4,500 highly trained Japanese sailors, soldiers, and elite aviators were killed. In stark, terrifying contrast, the American forces suffered incredibly light casualties. Task Force 58 lost merely 25 aircraft, with approximately 40 airmen listed as dead or missing in action, and only a single aircraft carrier, the USS Intrepid, suffered moderate damage from a lone, desperate nighttime torpedo attack. The sheer asymmetry of these numbers is stark enough on its own, but the raw numbers only describe what physically happened. They do completely fail to explain what this unprecedented destruction actually meant for the remainder of the Pacific War. The massive cargo ships resting permanently on the lagoon floor were not empty when they were violently sunk. Their deep, cavernous holds were packed tight with irreplaceable aircraft engine parts, heavy tanks, live torpedo warheads, artillery shells, and desperately needed transport trucks. This was the physical, irreplaceable inventory of an empire's forward reach, the vital material blood that moved the Japanese war machine steadily southward and westward. All of it was now resting quietly in 130 feet of clear blue water, permanently removed from the strategic equation. And then there was the devastating loss of the fuel. The massive destruction of the 77,000 tons of heavy bunker oil and aviation fuel reserves stockpiled at Truk Lagoon had a catastrophic, rippling consequence that stretched a full 8 months into the future. When the decisive Battle of Leyte Gulf finally erupted in October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy was violently compelled to sortie its remaining forces in widely separated, highly vulnerable battle groups. These fragmented fleets had to depart from different corners of the empire, some from the Japanese home islands and others from the Linga roads near Singapore, entirely because severe fuel constraints made mass concentration physically impossible. The legendary combined fleet could not mass its overwhelming firepower, could not properly coordinate its complex movements, and ultimately could not fight as a unified, lethal fleet. The towering pillars of black, oily smoke rising over the lagoon in February 1944 were essentially writing the definitive death warrant for the Japanese Navy at Leyte Gulf later that year. The fire in the Central Pacific directly translated into disjointed, uncoordinated battle groups that could not mutually support one another when the final, desperate moment of the empire came. But the deepest, most profound asymmetry of all was not found in the sunken ships or the burning fuel tanks. It was found in the fundamental, underlying reality of industrial capacity and human resilience. By this late stage of the brutal conflict, Japan's heavily strained wartime economy simply could not replenish such catastrophic simultaneous losses in specialized shipping, advanced aircraft, and highly trained manpower. America had successfully, miraculously rebuilt its shattered fleet from the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor in just 2 years to field the overwhelming, unstoppable force that flawlessly executed Operation Hailstone. Japan, deeply isolated and bleeding heavily from 1,000 cuts, could not rebuild from Hailstone at all. Pearl Harbor's vital oil storage facilities, submarine pens, and extensive dry dock repair yards had been famously, perhaps fatally, left entirely untouched by the Japanese strike force on December 7, 1941. Truk Lagoon, however, was fundamentally, systematically gutted from top to bottom. Pearl Harbor was incredibly painful and humiliating for the United States, but Truk Lagoon was permanent and fatal for the Japanese Empire. Let us conduct a final forensic audit of this unprecedented collapse. The balance sheet is incredibly stark and brutally clear. On the debit side of the ledger, we have 14 consecutive days of phantom threats, generated by nothing more than the intermittent buzzing of isolated reconnaissance planes. We have 0 American bombs dropped during this crucial 2-week preliminary phase. On the credit side, we have an entire highly fortified military garrison pushed far beyond the brink of clinical insanity and physical failure. We have hundreds of elite mechanics making catastrophic, unforced errors on flight lines they knew by heart. We have seasoned, hardened anti-aircraft commanders weeping in frustration as they ordered their men to stand down, knowing full well the agonizing risk they were taking. The success of Spruance and Mitchell lay not just in their overwhelming industrial force, but in their operational timing. They possessed the largest naval armada ever assembled up to that point. They could have launched an immediate frontal assault. Instead, whether by design or necessity, they approached methodically, and the delay applied immense psychological pressure to the Japanese defenders. They understood that the rigid, inflexible command structure of the Imperial Japanese Navy was fundamentally incapable of adapting to a slow, creeping threat. The Japanese system was designed to violently repel a sudden, kinetic shock, but it was absolutely defenseless against the slow, steady erosion of psychological attrition. When the general stand-down order was finally issued on February 16th, it was not a tactical decision, it was a desperate biological surrender. The fortress had already fallen before the first Hellcat fighter even started its engine on the deck of the Enterprise. Operation Hailstone definitively proves a brutal, unforgiving truth of modern military logistics. The fragile human mind consumes vital, irreplaceable resources just like a heavy radial engine consumes high-octane aviation fuel. A rigid military system that aggressively ignores the fundamental biological limits of its own soldiers will inevitably defeat itself long before the enemy even arrives on the battlefield. The Japanese High Command built a magnificent, terrifying fortress out of sharp coral, hardened steel, and thousands of tons of explosives, but they entirely failed to fortify the minds of the men required to operate it. They weaponized the uncompromising samurai ethos to a toxic, unsustainable degree, creating a brittle system that shattered under the excruciating weight of its own perpetual anxiety. The haunting, deeply melancholic image of the twisted wreckage resting silently at the bottom of Truk Lagoon today serves as a grim underwater memorial. It is not merely a memorial to the devastating power of American naval aviation, but a memorial to men who died utterly exhausted, fiercely fighting a terrifying ghost of their own creation for 2 agonizing weeks before the real killer finally knocked on their door. The United States Navy did not just defeat the Gibraltar of the Pacific with bombs and torpedoes. They starved the fortress of its sanity, drained it of its adrenaline, and patiently waited for the biological collapse to render the mighty guns completely silent. What are your thoughts on this ruthless, deeply psychological aspect of the Pacific War? Do you believe the American tactical delay was a stroke of brilliant, calculating military genius or simply a cruel, agonizing exploitation of human biological limitations? Share your unique perspectives, historical insights, and any family stories you might have in the comment section below. If you found this deep, forensic dive into the brutal realities of psychological warfare compelling, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more uncompromising analytical military history. In the unforgiving arithmetic of war, the most devastating weapon is often the one you cannot even see.